अस्सलाम वालेकुम रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू। मेरा नाम मुनज़्ज़ा जावेद अहमद काजी है। I wrote a letter. I was writing a letter. I had written a letter. I had been writing a letter for 2 hours. We wrote a letter. We were writing a letter. We had written a letter. We had been writing a letter for 2 hours. You wrote a letter. You were writing a letter. You had written a letter. You had been writing a letter for 2 hours. You wrote a letter. You were writing a letter. You had written a letter. You had been writing a letter for 2 hours. He wrote a letter. He was writing a letter. He had written a letter. He had been writing a letter for 2 hours. She wrote a letter. She was writing a letter. She had written a letter. She had been writing a letter for 2 hours. It wrote a letter. It was writing a letter. It had written a letter. It had been writing a letter for 2 hours. They wrote a letter. They were writing a letter. They had written a letter. They had been writing a letter for 2 hours. I did not write a letter. I was not writing a letter. I had not written a letter. I had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. We did not write a letter. We were not writing a letter. We had not written a letter. We had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. You did not write a letter. You were not writing a letter. You had not written a letter. You had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. You did not write a letter. You were not writing a letter. You had not written a letter. You had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. He did not write a letter. He was not writing a letter. He had not written a letter. He had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. She did not write a letter. She was not writing a letter. She had not written a letter. She had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. It did not write a letter. It was not writing a letter. It had not written a letter. It had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. They did not write a letter. They were not writing a letter. They had not written a letter. They had not been writing a letter for 2 hours. Did I write a letter? Was I writing a letter? Had I written a letter? Had I been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did we write a letter? Were we writing a letter? Had we written a letter? Had we been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did you write a letter? Were you writing a letter? Had you written a letter? Had you been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did you write a letter? Were you writing a letter? Had you written a letter? Had you been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did he write a letter? Was he writing a letter? Had he written a letter? Had he been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did she write a letter? Was she writing a letter? Had she written a letter? Had she been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did it write a letter? Was it writing a letter? Had it written a letter? Had it been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did they write a letter? Were they writing a letter? Had they written a letter? Had they been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did I not write a letter? Was I not writing a letter? Had I not written a letter? Had I not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did we not write a letter? Were we not writing a letter? Had we not written a letter? Had we not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did you not write a letter? Were you not writing a letter? Had you not written a letter? Had you not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did you not write a letter? Were you not writing a letter? Had you not written a letter? Had you not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did he not write a letter? Was he not writing a letter? Had he not written a letter? Had he not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did she not write a letter? Was she not writing a letter? Had she not written a letter? Had she not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did it not write a letter? Was it not writing a letter? Had it not written a letter? Had it not been writing a letter for 2 hours? Did they not write a letter? Were they not writing a letter? Had they not written a letter? Had they not been writing a letter for 2 hours?